Yesterday it was a nice day for everybody, I think. Everything went smoothly, and we do hope today also to wrap up the discussions. And you can hear, yes, I can hear, you can hear me. So I'm really happy here and honored and well, to have Christine here. And despite all the obstacles we had to circumvent, she's here, and we're very eager to hear you, of course. But I will ask Diederick to come here to take the floor and to moderate the discussion. Just a small information, we're going to go along as the program says today, and we will have our AGM between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. So let's start. Thank you.
Just very briefly, today we have the last session first before the coffee break, and then after the coffee break we have the round table that closes the conference. And then in the afternoon, as Nani mentioned, the annual general meeting for ENSSER members and candidate members. This is the session about the future. Where should we go from here? We've heard the problems that we have between science and policy yesterday in 2 sessions. And today we will hear ideas about how to proceed, how to improve the situation. Our first speaker, Christine von Weizsäcker, is a biologist, a member of the advisory board of the Federation of German Scientists, a member of the scientific committee of the German Society on Human Ecology, and last but not least, a founding member of ENSSER. She has very extensive experience in the negotiations about biodiversity and biosafety at the United Nations level. And I think she will tell us about that. Christine, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being up so early on a Saturday morning. You may notice that the title that is there is different from the title announced in the program, because the crucial word sound was somehow being lost in the internet communication, and it's sound science, as opposed to the best available scientific knowledge. And I'm going to, it is more or less one other example, like the examples yesterday, of how all that has been presented yesterday, which I enjoyed hearing very much, has an implication on the wording and on the terminology. And there is a strong fight going on between those 2 terms. What does it mean? To a normal person, which negotiators are not, these 2 terms have pretty much the same meaning. But when fake news and fake information flood internet, media, and policy, why does the legal wordsmithing at multilateral environmental negotiation matter? Does it? Should we not stand together and defend both sound science and the best available scientific knowledge? And I'm sorry to say that I didn't translate this one. It slipped from a German presentation. Protect the right to science for people and the planet. Upholding human rights can ensure that environmental policy is driven by facts and evidence, not denialism, greed, and profit. And Antonio, that has been published by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, in Nature. And Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said, without really concentrating on human rights, the United Nations have to close down. You know all the sustainable development discussion, the 17 goals, but the goals are arranged in a way that you have ministries in charge of them. And different ministries are responsible for different sectors. Different branches of industry are differently affected by one or more goals. Different states in different regions around the globe have different priorities in their national implementation. Like you said yesterday, and different social groups have different access to power, decision-making are differently affected by risks and benefits of different goals. So it's not so easy. It's not an easy package, these 17 goals. Environmental ministries and environmental civil society organizations keep complaining that environmental SDGs only rank in position 13, 14, 15 in a catalogue of 17. But instead of complaining, it can be argued that the essential first two SDGs, no poverty, first one, and zero hunger and sustainable agriculture, can only be achieved if SDGs 13, 14, and 15 create the basis for this achievement. Actually, SDGs, all other SDGs, are based on these three. This is also relevant for the goal on peace, which cannot be reached if conflicts on ever scarcer resources increase and the very basis of livelihoods is seriously threatened. Now, let's look at no poverty. The poor do not have the money to buy their survival in the global market competition. They need climate action, biodiversity protection, sustainable use. They need rights and they need precaution. They cannot buy their way out of damage and catastrophes. It is normally called in the multilateral discourse, they cannot discount the future as the rich can do. What does discounting the future really mean? To accumulate money by business as usual, and then use the money to buy the way out of damages caused by these strategies. The Stern report on climate change and the Teeb and Gupta reports on biological diversity showed that discounting strategies are macroeconomic nonsense. This is taken from Teeb. Neither the state nor the formal market, but ecosystems provide for the livelihoods of the poor. So this is the top level is the normal GDP counting. The second one is taking ecosystem services and count the GDP of the poor. You see that the poor really rely on ecosystem services, on an intact nature. And they all would say, the state failed us, the market failed us, biodiversity is our life insurance in a changing world, which was a quote from what the Executive Secretary on the Convention on Biological Diversity, Ahmed Jugla, so rightly said. Should we continue to trust in business as usual economics, that is, attract investors, and hope for the never really confirmed trickle-down effect for the poor? Or can we learn from recent Nobel Prizes in economics? Amartya Sen, welfare economics, Joe Stiglitz on the asymmetries of information, and later on a lot of publications about the asymmetries of power. Elinor Ostrom on the governance of the commons. It is not only about risks to whom, but also economic potential for whom, often unfairly distributed. There often are direct benefits in innovative fields. I come back to the term innovation later. Researchers profit from increased funding for their projects. Companies increase their shareholder value with these new promises. And I really like to have the market as a market of promises, not a market of facts. So there are early benefits for some at a time when neither benefits nor risks for other constituencies and concerns had the chance to be thoroughly investigated. Thus, we arrived at the often used term unquestionable benefits and hypothetical risks. This leads to the conclusion that the poor and underprivileged need prevention of identified risks, but also need to be protected by precaution if there are strong indications of potential risks. How do the two terms sound science and best available scientific knowledge interact with this? We have the precautionary principle in Rio, at the Earth Summit in Rio. In situations where scientific knowledge is incomplete, and this is the normal situation, and if there are indications of severe or irreversible harm, states should act. Sound science principle, as is interpreted by many court decisions in the US, unless there is complete scientific evidence on the causal chain leading to a certain damage, unless results are published in peer-reviewed relevant journals, and unless there is scientific consensus, governments may and must not act. Any such action would be interpreted as violation of free trade agreements. Between strong indications and final scientific conclusions, there may be decades of harm. So this is how these two are situated, and pertaining to environmental protection and consumer protection and rights, that was the central bone of contention between US and Europe in the negotiations of the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, and is still pertinent in all recent trade negotiations. Let me point to the fact that in the Roman statutes of the EU, the precautionary principle is embedded. And this is a very good bonus for our discussion. Best available scientific knowledge is in alliance with the precautionary principle, which seems, after all, to be a pro-poor strategy. Sound science means that prevention is possible, but only if the causal chain has been completely proven, and if there is scientific consensus, which can easily be undone by two institutes, one in Russia and one in the US, as you know from the climate negotiations. Thus, sound science means postponement of governance, reversal of the burden of proof, and the poor cannot discount the future and suffer. You know, this is a well-known picture of multiple crises, but it's yet incomplete. There is ongoing poverty, hunger, violence, disasters, and conflicts. How does science react to these multiple crises? On the one hand, disciplinary research has standing, established quality standards, and receives the bulk of funding. Disciplinary journals for peer-reviewed papers are still prevalent. I was involved in founding some online interdisciplinary publications, peer-reviewed journals, and it's very difficult. Scientific careers still depend on such publication. In certain new fields, the expertise is narrow. How about universities? Even public sector expertise is not necessarily wide and independent due to the increase in public-private partnerships, patent application, and the increasing political perception of university as priority factors in a country's global economic competitiveness. All this makes patentable technofixes to selected elements of each of these crises so attractive. But there is something else, and it was pointed to yesterday already. Recent assessments of important international scientific bodies unanimously agree that we have to learn to address these multiple and interlinked crises in a systemic, multidimensional, cross-sectoral, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and participatory way. And I add all the links to the IBES and IPCC and UNEP and CBD and WHO. There are others on disaster risk reduction, a very valuable reading. All these international scientific reports point to the need to identify and address causal links in the network of interaction between all the direct and indirect drivers of these crises, even daring to challenge our present economic systems. Some of them do. It means seeking sustainable solutions at all levels. It also means systematically include other systems of knowledge and alternative solutions. And by the way, IBES, the one on biodiversity, has in its founding statutes the inclusion of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. And this was exemplified by the inclusion of the knowledge and experience of beekeepers when the study on pollinators was being published. So it doesn't mean that you have to remain chained to the momentarily most fashionable technofixes like geoengineering, solar radiation, it was called management. It's now called, oh, help me. Modification, yes, thank you. And the new gene technology relying on CRISPR-Cas. It also means that the multiple capacities for scientific horizon scanning, assessment, and monitoring of proposed solutions, projects, programs, policies, strategies, and technologies have to be built. And this doesn't exist. It means that the focus of research and its funding has to be dramatically shifted under these multiple crises. Oops. And now we come to the Atlas syndrome. You know, the Greek giant Atlas who carried the earth. And Atlas carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. But even many well-meaning and responsible scientists are not immune to such perceptions. They want to make the great plan for saving the planet. But calling us world hunger, workforce, human capital, natural capital, environment, CO2 sinks, biomass is usual. This way of speaking, however, may implicitly already violate our local and historical particularities, distinctiveness, our uniqueness and embedded in diversity, our networks of relationships and cooperation, our intrinsic values and our dignity, and cooperative systemic scientific approaches. You see the giant just has the feet in the air, and people sometimes don't really believe him if he says, I'm carrying global responsibility and design the scenarios for our common future. The reality of sustainable solutions will depend on creative cooperative implementation at all levels, including the local one. Scientists are welcome as partners, but not as exclusive conductors and orchestrators of these efforts. But what are the international tools? There is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, very good reading, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas, and the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And there is a very important policy brief by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, human rights-based approaches to conserving biodiversity, equitable, effective, imperative. At the interface of science, ethics, law, and policy, you have internationally agreed principles. The subsidiary principle that reaches back to Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and is a widely accepted principle of governance. You have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You have the principles of international law as expressed in the Vienna Convention. You have the democracy principle, Principle 10 of Rio. You have prevention and the precautionary principle, also from Rio, and you have the polluter pays principle, also from Rio. I skipped that one. I simply go to the polluter pays principle. Liability of polluters and redress for victims also at international level. Victims pay the price for damage automatically and always. It takes regulation to make the polluters responsible and liable, and it's a strong incentive for them to also apply precaution, because there is a price to pay later. One of the recommendations of TEEB is changing the incentives, pointing to polluter pays and full cost recovery. I just want to point to the very important publication where David G., one of the ENSSER members, was one of the driving forces, laid lessons from early warnings on the precautionary principle. And then I have to say that fake news doesn't necessarily mean that you have to tell lies. You simply have to push in the media contradictory conclusions. And then the public often responds with resignation. Nobody knows anyway. I can't do anything. I can't decide. I can't find my way through the different types of expertise. And this is resignation. Resignation is a very useful tool politically. The fact that scientists address laws of nature does not mean that their interests should be seen as law of nature. And as pointed out yesterday already, conflict of interest policies and strategies need to be firmly established and implemented, especially for organizations tasked with research policy, research funding, and technology assessment. IPBES has a conflict of interest policy, so does the Convention on Biological Diversity. We need procedures and structures to stop the expertocratic undermining of the separation of political powers, legislation, administration, jurisdiction. But if all three of them are dependent on the same narrow group of experts in a new narrow field of innovation, what happens? It undermines the separation. An additional reason why multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches are important. But does it not become too complex? And now again, a link to policy. The term complexity in politics is often abused as a synonym for too difficult for the public to understand. Public, keep out, leave it to the experts. On the other hand, systems analysis shows us that complex, well-contextualized networks of many variables and concerns can be very stable, more comfortable, and allow for good company. Again, diversity is our life insurance in a changing world. How many linkages and knots can you neglect, disrupt, or delete from an existing complex, historically and locally contextualized system before you fall out the hammock of your home? And now we come to innovation. I simply tell you the story shortly. Let me see, how much time do I still have? Okay. There was a program initiated by EU research and a conglomerate of 8 universities got the project. It was on reconciling innovation and precaution by involvement of stakeholders. And I was invited as one of the stakeholders. It became obvious that in the opening session already, an expert from a research institute closely linked and with a conflict of interest with CropLife International had the only keynote. So Nina Holland from Corporate Europe Observatory, the consumers representative and the unions representative pressed that there should be a second keynote. And one day before the presentation, I got the task of doing a very short additional keynote. So, and the concept of innovation was pressed by the German chemical industry first, put to the European level, and they pretended there was an innovation principle. And when looking at the whole literature, it all came back to a publication in the former Soviet Union in the 60s, saying 70 innovation principles to predict the patentability of a new product. So that was the innovation principle, which is not really a legal principle, but it poses as such. So new types of innovation are being proposed which move beyond mere patentable techno-fixes. The latter remain, of course, influential in the global market competition and make it in the daily news. And then, after the debate had been opened, they called it in a next step, a next paper, they called it responsible innovation. Now, what does responsibility mean? The ability, sometimes even obligation, to respond. This may range from personal integrity to voluntary guidelines and to strict liability, and the obligation to provide financial security, including taking insurance. The insurance sector, which I'm following closely for decades, does not like potential damages of great extent combined with an unknown probability of occurrence. They ask for a high price or even refuse to insure, like in agriculture. This could be an incentive for the risk takers to apply precaution. The old and very recent debates on the inclusion of liability and redress in the EU supply chain legislation indicates the importance of Principle 16 in this context, the precautionary principle. So we have benefits for whom, damage to whom. Once a scientific trend has achieved the status key technology of the 21st century, or Industrial Revolution 4.0, unbiased assessments may not be carried out anymore. And now let us complement the term innovation with speed of innovation. Science is speedy. Speed counts in competition, funding, first to publish, first to apply for a patent, first linking research to development, no time to look for wider and complex implications. Speedy market, speed counts, the winner takes it all, no time to look at wider implications, let alone biodiversity and the obligations of CBD parties. And again, patents play a huge role there. Now, there is a publication on partially debrained fish who cannot perceive the surrounding environment and other fish, and may only not, but they become the leaders of the group because all others react. They don't. So is this advisable for international rules of ensuring sustainability, leadership by the fastest process? In some areas of technology, the introduction of the next generation product and consecutive generation products is much faster than the production of evidence of their impacts on the environment and human health and other concerns. So if you ask chemical industry, what was in the washing powder that ended up in the sludge of the river? They say, we have the next generation and the next generation already. But how can you be sure they don't do any damage? There is often a leadership by the fastest process. It leads to sloppy and narrow scientific assessment, disregard for wider contexts, and also disregard for slowing down elements such as citizens' information and participation in decision-making, labor standards, human rights, and the precautionary principle. And now we are nearly finished. If the speed of innovation towards market approval outruns the knowledge about its impact, is a steady pathway of learning still possible? Is science leaving its culture of trial and error, reaching the realm of hypotheticality? There are publications on that, where adventures of the size of the history of humankind are being entered with innovation as the new godline unquestioned director. How can humankind and its future generations be asked? How can a society with a gigantic, well-funded innovation potential on the part of the technofix toolmakers, combined with frightening gaps in technology horizon scanning, assessment and monitoring, and also weaknesses in establishing common ground as to social ends, move forwards, really earning the title high-tech technology, high-tech society, with suitable tools to serve its complex ends based on well-discussed political and legal structures. And I learned a lot from the Greek word techne, which really describes that link. So let me end. In what turmoil of terms and concepts, including subsidiarity, prevention, precaution, separation of political powers, democracy, technofixes, speed of innovation, human rights, justice, did we enter when just a reflection based on sound science and based on the best available scientific knowledge was announced? I think we should thank all ENSSER members, and there are a few here, who, aware of the former, fight patiently, cooperatively, and diligently for good wording in multilateral negotiations. Let us give them a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was not only very, very clear, crystal clear, but also very moving. We have no excuse for moving on, for not knowing where to go. It's all very, very clear. For time's sake, we were to have a little discussion after each talk, but for time's sake, I would like to allow just one question. And yesterday we had to stop a few people from asking their questions and giving their comments. One of the victims was an online participant, Siguna Mueller, and she has a question to Christina now. So can she be allowed to ask it online, Lucas?
Christina, thank you so much. I want to profoundly express my gratitude for answering many of the concerns that I had. Yesterday, I wanted to ask one question, and the question was, why consensus? Why is consensus needed? And let me just briefly give you the background. My first doctorate degree is in mathematics, and I did my habilitation in data security and cryptography, and my second PhD is in biomedical sciences. So I was brought up as someone rewarded for critical thinking. And over the last few years, I have, with shock and horror, observed the trend towards consensus. And even in terms of cybersecurity, suddenly there is the emergence of Delphi methods and related to build consensus. And in reality, we know it's the complete opposite. It's the complete opposite in data security. You only need one person to outsmart the rest, and you have big trouble. The same in biology. You know, it's diversity. All we need is diversity. So what happened that shifted this culture from critical thinking, independent thinking, out of the box thinking? Those were the terms I used when, decades ago when writing grant proposals, and that I was rewarded for. And I mean, is there any chance we can get back to this, or are we all doomed to be becoming prey to AI? Thank you again for your talk.
Thank you for that question. It's a long story about consensus. We had a presentation yesterday, how to fabricate it. And it all depends also on some technical legal issues about the international conventions. For instance, the Convention on Biological Diversity never agreed on the rules of procedure. So decisions of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity for legal reasons need consensus. So one country can break consensus. In a way, fortunately, at the moment, the US are not party, the US and the Vatican are the only countries not party to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the US at the moment cannot break consensus because they are not a party. But any other country can do that. And all the nights, in the last night to the last morning, people missing their flights go about reaching consensus. But consensus also has another aspect in science. You know that in normal science, as was described, there is a basic consensus on some concepts. But then you have new scientific steps like modern physics, scientific revolutions, for which you should get Nobel Prizes, not for comparing two types of ants or grasshoppers and call it a scientific innovation. These are breaking the consensus of former times. And so breaking consensus always was a very important tool in science, breaking consensus by criticizing and peer reviewing, not in that normal way that it's done nowadays, but questioning and I've studied the discussions between thermodynamics and traditional physics in the 19th century in Paris. There was fighting going on, fisticuffs even. So consensus is not necessarily part of science. Even breaking the consensus is a very important step in science. And so you have two elements. One is at the multilateral policy level, where the absence of rules of procedure make it difficult. And the other level is the scientific level, where breaking consensus is considered a creative step.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thanks very much. We'll move on to the second talk now. Within ENSSER, we've been thinking a lot about how to reform science, if we can do that, at least to define what's wrong with science and to find ways out. And these two speakers have been doing a lot of thinking about that and to summarize that. The first of them is Dr. Ulrich Loening from Scotland. He is a biologist. He is retired as director of the Centre for Human Ecology in Glasgow. And he is a retired reader from the Department of Zoology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And he is a member of ENSSER, last but not least. Ulrich, the floor is yours.
Yes. Okay, can I put the first slide on? It's been a fantastic conference, full of incredible detail. I've learned so much. I don't know where I stand, but what I'm doing in my presentation, I hope, is going back a step. Let's look at the origins of where we are and where science is, and then take it forward to where we are now, which is what most of this meeting is about. So I ask you to just switch your mind slightly and look at some basics. I can only just see my slides here. So we start with where it all started, and I will show that, in fact, where it all started, what I call, and Francisco Sagasti called, thank you, the Baconian project. Galileo, Descartes, Francis Bacon, Spinoza, a whole group of thinkers of the 17th century set what we call science on its path. And that path, that's in the first slide when it's there. Okay, now I want to go one back. Press. Yeah, the Baconian project, we can call it, and it's a useful concept because we're still using it. It's dying, and I'm hoping that this talk and the next one from Ephraim will help it die faster. It's based on these principles. I don't know why this switch is.
I did it, sorry.
Just go back again. Can I go back? No, I can't.
If you like,
No, I'll do the buttons. It's okay, but I don't want it switched. So I want the first slide. Okay.
Let me open it again.
So what do we do?
Just 1 second.
The Baconian project set the scene of what we have criticized often in many ways of reductionism, that we look at the fundamentals of what's going on. When the problem becomes too complex, we take it down into little pieces and try and solve them one by one. But the important conclusion, which Francis Bacon was explicit about, is that knowledge, just knowledge, has intrinsic power. If you know something, you can do something that you couldn't have done if you didn't know it. And to show that that still matters, my second slide. No, doesn't. Am I pressing the wrong thing? It's this one I tried.
That one is the next.
This one's the next. I'm going backwards. Okay, now we're going too quick. The top is obscured by all the razzmatazz of the technology. Descartes was quite clear about the power. If we have it, we can make ourselves the lords and possessors of nature. And that was followed by Robert Boyle, among others. The good of mankind may be much increased by the naturalist insight, that's what the language of the time was, into the trades. And even in the middle of the 20th century, see, get rid of the black rubbish there. Even in the middle of the 20th century, C.P. Snow would still write what I said there. The control of the natural world is what the power has given us. And it was very necessary in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries that we did control nature. We had to protect ourselves. Life was short and brutish, and now it's wonderful. Look at you. Now, what actually came is that even now, it's off the side, the Royal Society in London's mission statement reflects Robert Boyle's original, that what we're doing is for the good of humanity. And at some stage, I have not been able to find out why or when, I even wrote to them, the good of the planet has been added for the benefit of humanity. And the two are in conflict. The good of the planet, it turns out, is actually not what we are doing at the moment. And most of this meeting has been about that. So what do we do? And so I looked a little bit. We've added quite a lot to what the 17th century did. The biggest ones are statistics and the distribution of variance and complexity theory. And the result of both of these is that science speaks in legal language, science speaks the truth and nothing but the truth, but because of the complexity, it cannot in any way at all speak the whole truth. And hence we can have a lack of consensus where the whole truth is missing. Now, as I've shown, the application of science lets us intervene in nature. It's a great difference intervening from observing. Galileo's observing the moons of Jupiter was pure observation. Whatever he did couldn't change the moons of Jupiter. His own work on gravity was a bit of both, because there's friction, and you can go on thinking about that. Observation is difficult. In agriculture, the use of fertilizers seemed like an observation when made by Liebig in 1843. But in fact, it's a gross intervention. It affects the whole of the biosphere. It's wrecked modern agriculture. The whole of it was a simple intervention which wasn't recognized as such at the time and was followed and created the agrochemical industry. And look where we are. I am bold and late in my career. I don't have anything to lose, and I can say it was a huge mistake. There's a whole lot on that, of course, too. expand. Now, in industrial countries, the conventional science guides how we live, as I've described. Now, that same conventional science is telling us that actually we have to reverse. That now nature needs protecting from us instead of us from nature. And for that purpose, I thought we must invent a new word to emphasize how the progress of science has to change. And I thought long and hard. Biologists typically use in vivo and in vitro to describe whether their experiments are in the test tubes or in life. And so I thought perhaps con vivo is a good way to describe what we need to do of observation, and the adjective of con vivo is convivial. And so I've reached the same conclusion that the next speaker will talk about. I think it may be an accident of the English language that we have the same, we certainly have different origins, but that's where we are. If we can reverse what science, the main purpose of science is now to save the planet, not to save us anymore. The implications are so great, I'm not going to discuss them. This meeting did a lot of that, but it did it at the final end, and I'm trying to look at the beginning. I think that will do. Thank you very much, and here we are.
Thank you so much, Ulrich. That was perfectly clear and quick as well. We're catching up a bit with the time now. The second speaker is Dr. Ephraim Pörtner from Switzerland, and after him, we'll have questions to both of them. Ephraim is an affiliated researcher in political geography at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, and he is one of the two executive directors of Critical Scientists Switzerland. And Critical Scientists Switzerland are one of the co-founders of this conference, and they are part of ENSSER. Ephraim, the floor is yours.
It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and speak to you. The somewhat clumsy title of my presentation is Why Science is Currently Conceived as Part of the Problem and How Could Become Part of the Solution. And what I'm telling you is based on discussions with people from within our network. So with members of ENSSER and Sciences Citoyennes, and the analysis and synthesis of an extensive literature as well about what's been going wrong with dominant strands of science that we've written up at CSS and that will come out as a book soon. It resonates with many things that have been discussed at this conference so far, and I will only have time to flag a few points that I consider important that add something to the discussions we already had so far. It's important to say we don't have remedies for the problems of dominant science, but maybe points of departure. And I hope we can all connect to them in some ways at the end of this conference. So Western science, I think this has been alluded to extensively, has been a double-edged sword. It can be a source of curiosity and sustained critical inquiry, as Ignacio told at the very beginning in the opening discussion, and leading to deep insights about the world and ourselves. And that's the kind we're fond of, and also I think Ulrich alluded to, and that we would like to see to flourish. But as talks and discussions at this conference so far have made clear, that's not a science that is now dominating. It's the Baconian science with its imagery of control and subjugation of nature to man, as Ulrich just pointed out. I would like to use the words of environmental philosopher Val Plumwood, whose work I greatly admire, to counter this. Reason has been made a vehicle for domination and death, and it must become a vehicle for liberation and life again. There is, however, another elephant in the room, and that's the colonial relations of science, sort of the darker side of the Western history of Western science that deserves some more attention at this conference as well, I think. So contrary to the Western and Eurocentric narrative of the scientific revolutions, today's dominant science is to be conceived of as a specifically Western invention, a contingent, time-specific and culture-specific activity that, as also Ignacio already pointed out, emerged in the 17th century England and promised salvation through technoscience, and was always closely associated with power and empire. By distancing itself from the world and creating the illusion of the universal view from nowhere, it claimed for itself superior access to knowledge and about the world. Contrary to what is still taught in many schools, this system of knowledge does not serve all humanity, but only a small portion of it that benefits from the belief that in terms of epistemology, there's only one game in town. This means, and that's maybe another inconvenient truth, that the history of science is meticulously uncovered. It's not because Western science is superior in its grasp to knowledge that it has prevailed in history, but it's come to dominate the world through European colonial and imperial practices to suppress, discredit, and erase other forms of knowledge and epistemologies, what Southern scholars have called epistemicide. And it went hand in hand with killing the people, holding that knowledge, or destroying the ecologies and livelihoods that this knowledge was associated with, and taking their resources and land, usually. And the knowledge, taking the knowledge has also taken knowledge away from people, has also been called epistemic extractivism. So the appropriation of local knowledges for the benefit of Western scientists, rulers or corporations. As for example, a Puerto Rican sociologist, Ramon Gross-Fruguel, noted. In the extractivist mindset, he said, the aim is to appropriate traditional knowledge so that transnational corporations can draft up private patents, or also academics in Western universities can claim to have produced original ideas as if they held the copyright to them. One well-known, more recent example for this sort of epistemic extractivism is the sweetener steviol glycoside derived from the plant stevia growing in Southern America. For the latter, an example would be the incorporation of traditional ecological knowledges, sometimes without including sort of the more deeper relational approaches and ontologies that people live in, that this knowledge derives from, right? And so we have to, I think, reckon with this elephant in the room of Western science and make sure any birthing of other pathways towards different forms of science remediate sort of for this deeply troubling history. And that is sort of decolonial by default or in practice. This also means, and there I think I link up again with things that have been said already with at the conference, it needs to be less monolithic and more pluriversal sciences that embrace many ways of seeing, making sense of and being in the world, as various scholars have proposed. Then another point I think that deserves some more I think focus is the notion of value neutrality. And I think Eric Millstone yesterday hinted at the end of his talk at the fact that values might also influence academic science, not only regulatory science. And I fully agree, and I think it needs emphasis. Barbara Risman, an American sociologist, has expressed this succinctly. She wrote, in general, value neutrality can be a cloak that hides, perhaps even from scientists themselves, values that are so embedded in folk wisdom of our culture as to be invisible. Researchers who believe they're working within an apolitical, value-neutral version of science are, often without any conscious decision at all, simply ignoring the ways in which dominant presumptions frame their questions or concerns or goals. And it appears that since the 1950s, in Germany even earlier, there have been attempts to purify the image of science of its political and economic interconnections that were, interestingly, previously quite openly acknowledged. In the case of scientists in Nazi Germany, historian of science Robert Proctor has noted that Science was often tolerated as a faithful and neutral servant, an engine of economic and military power, blind to politics. Many fields of scholarship did turn out cheering squads for fascism, but just as frightening are the legions of subservience who continued to work quietly, reassured by the myth of cloistered neutrality. Through this lens, the good science of the Reich becomes evidence not of heroic ideological innocence, but of a blind-eyed failure to reflect and resist irresponsible purity. In another historian of sciences, Herbert Merton's aptly crafted phrase. So the view that science is not political, or that it should strive away as far from politics as possible, remains widespread. And that is no accident. As historian Philip Mirowski explained in his book, The Effortless Economy of Science, both philosophers of science and economists played an active role in the neoliberal reconstitution of the economy. We heard about this yesterday by Irina, amongst others, which sought to establish a sphere for science that was perceived as completely separate from political and economic relations. What does that mean for us? Instead of falling into the comforting trap of a value-neutral science, we should be explicit about our values, which comes up, or it goes hand in hand with the possibility for real accountability, responsibility that was also, I think, often mentioned at this conference. And then we can also denounce sort of the attempts to work with the purity or value neutrality that many hide behind, and denounce the irresponsible purity of any pretense in that case. These are just two issues that arose in our analysis of why today's dominant science is often part of the problem. It's maybe part of the more contentious ones. That's also why I bring them up here. But we think we should strive to reorient science towards the people and their socio-ecological relations, as Irina and others have already proposed. However, to achieve this, we think we need to rethink, reclaim, maybe even radically transform science. And for this purpose, we propose uniting strands of critical inquiry that most of you, I think, are involved in under the label of convivial sciences. And that term was, as Ulrich mentioned, it was inspired by him, but also turned out to be used in the meantime by different strands of critical inquiry already. So there's sort of variable emphasis of meaning within the term convivial science, but we think it's a good banner to work with. However, transforming sciences or even gathering under such a banner might not be that easy. We also need to know what we're up against and grapple with the forces resisting to change. The old strategy of divide and conquer has worked too well for those in power, and authoritative scientific knowledge has been key to this, as has many examples at this conference, I think, showed. And therefore, not being ruled by division requires considerable tolerance of ambiguity and dissonance at times, whether as scientists, citizens, or policymakers. It also requires active procedures and rituals for disagreeing well. And we consider these to be at the heart of convivial sciences, or a convivialist chant of sciences as well. Therefore, we call together under the banner of convivial sciences, which are plural forms of science grounded in mutual responsibility and civilized disagreement. And we derive this not from the term in convivo as Ulrich, but from the Retro-Romanic term convivenza. And such critique, but it also includes, I mean, that we have to reconnect to each other and to our ecological relations. So it encompasses your term, Ulrich, I think. And such critical inquiry shouldn't only include scientists, but all sorts of practitioners, also critical journalists, independent thinkers of all kinds. While the scientific worldview has promoted the illusion of dominance and control, separating knowledge from responsibility, and resulting in violence and ecological destruction, it's imperative to rediscover science's potential to foster intimacy and respect for other beings. And there, I think, are very along the lines of Ulrich, but as also Robin Wall Kimmerer, a botany professor and indigenous scholar, has so powerfully suggested. For those who would like to read the full analysis of the problems we identified and the sort of pathways we propose, I can refer you to the book that is coming out soon. But we also recorded a first season of a podcast called Beyond the Fix, which features ENSSER members, ESS members, and people beyond, and which, as the name suggests, looks at in-depth perspectives on techno-fixes for complex problems and alternative, different approaches. Beyond the Fix. Beyond the Fix. There's also flyers out there. I will conclude by inviting you to join us in envisioning convivial sciences, the pathways and obstacles towards them, and embarking on the rather adventurous journey of enacting the necessary transformations together in convivenza. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ephraim. There's now time for a few questions from the room and from online to Ulrich and Ephraim. Just a few, and then we move on to the last talk of this morning before the coffee break. Who wants the microphone? And this also holds for the online participants.
Thank you so much for this fabulous morning session. Definitely worthwhile getting up earlier, coming here on a Saturday. It's been brilliant because you did already, all three of you, what you've been proposing, you united strands of thought. And thank you very much for referring to the different individuals and their thinking, etc. And it is what we urgently need now, you know, suggestions for how can we move forward now. The analysis are done, we essentially know what to do. It's just about overcoming, uniting our forces, our thinking, and overcoming the obstacles to change. And there is something that came to my mind when Christina gave her talk. One of the big obstacles in reaching and moving forward in the sound science and the comparison of the different understandings of science is sound science, you know, the requirements you listed only apply for assessing or evaluating impact or risk or harm. It does not apply. There is no requirement for sound science for the promises and the claimed benefits. And this is a gross asymmetry that really erodes trust and is a glaring double standard that also, you know, lead to what I presented yesterday, the lawsuits, the legal procedures. You know, you're making claims, you're with spurious or speculative or shoddy science to underpin it. But if somebody comes up and says, well, maybe not, and maybe this has consequences, you're confronted with delivering a chain of proofs already that are impossible because the technology itself doesn't even work. You know, but it has all kinds of implications by not working as it has been claimed. So this kind of contradiction and these obstacles, I think they also need to be mentioned and worked out. And I'd be curious to hear what you think about it. Shouldn't Christina be up there as well?
No, Christina had her
Okay.
questions. This is just,
Well, sorry.
you want to react, but let's allow the speakers to react first.
I haven't understood where your question is. There's a lot of comment there, which I can answer. Sound science, I don't know. One
Well,
has
it's
to
double
be,
standards in assessing and evaluating techno fixes and scientific achievements.
what do we regard as the truth is what you're getting at, I suppose. And it's very difficult to be sure. Of course, that's in the nature of science. But in the world we are in, you will agree with me, we are acting, like I said yesterday, a Homo sapiens insanus. And sound science has told us that. or at least science has told us that. I regard that science as sound, but that is a biased view. I see that. But I think that is what we have to have. It takes us back really to Galileo, whether the sun goes round the earth or the earth round the sun. You know, which is it? And how do you judge when the science that shows that the earth goes round the sun is correct, which Galileo maintained, against huge opposition? And if we have that sort of opposition now from science, not from the church, then we're in trouble if we take too much notice of it. We have to be blunt like they were. Well, okay, that's a part answer. I don't know that it's really answered it.
Yeah.
The loudspeakers, I mean, make that comment, boom everything, so it's hard to follow.
Could you give Christine the microphone, please, because she wants to react to this. But we have to be brief now.
I'm going to be very brief. I wanted to congratulate you on the convivial, which was used by Ivan Illich ages ago, and also want to complement your terminology about extractive knowledge with what I called cognostic knowledge, which would, I have written on that one. I haven't presented it. So, but to, well, let's stop here. I just wanted to introduce the terminology cognostic knowledge as an antidote against extractive knowledge, which of course has to do with colonialism, with continued extractivism, which is in a way accumulating at the moment in international negotiations, in the negotiations on digital sequence information, which is extractivism to the extreme, and the application of the artificial intelligence in combination with digital sequence information. When I was told, when I said I wanted to study computer science and molecular biology in the early 60s, I was told, oh child, too breadless art. But they're not breadless, and they're very powerful now.
Thank you very much.
Christine. He is, of course, partly Greek. I gather you were born in New York, but bred in Athens, right here. Professor John Ioannidis, Professor of Medicine at Stanford University. He's a physician and a scientist, professor of many different things, not just medicine, but also epidemiology and population health, and by courtesy of biomedical data science, all at Stanford University. He's probably best known for his extensive publications on the scientific standards of evidence, which are not met in much published research. We'll have questions after your talk. Don't forget to keep some time for that before the coffee break. The floor is yours, Professor Ioannidis.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I've heard lots of very interesting ideas this morning, and I look forward to discussing them further. So I will share some thoughts on reproducible and trustworthy science, looking at an evidence-based approach and meta-research approach. I think we all agree that science can be the best thing that can happen to humans, but at the same time, it's very complex. It is very unpredictable. It can be conflicted. It is massive. We have about 200 million papers that comprise the scientific literature. We have 7 more million papers published every year. And most of those are advertisements. People say, I have done this work, but if you want the raw data, if you want the code, if you want the real machinery of what was done, that is not available. Just trust me. I did this, and this is how it is, and it should be fine. But we know that this is not fine. We have a major replication crisis, a reproducibility crisis that has been recognized across multiple fields. So the question is, can we do better? Now, first of all, science is a conglomerate, is a universe of many, many disciplines. This is a map of science that I have drawn along with Kevin Boyack, one of my colleagues. Each dot here is a subdiscipline. There's about 500,000 dots in this plot. Each of them is using the scientific method and research practices in a different form. We all say we use the scientific method, but how much attention we give to registering our ideas or to being transparent for sharing our data, or how much criticism we allow, or what types of criticisms, and how we communicate with other dots in that universe, how much one galaxy is willing to travel to another galaxy to converse and exchange ideas. That varies a lot. Moreover, science is changing very rapidly in terms of who is doing what. This is a classic paper in Science published about 30 years ago when I was publishing my first scientific papers. At that time, about a third of scientific papers came from the US. About 50% of citations were to these papers. About 95% of papers came from what we would call Western democracies. And China was like 0.9% of the scientific literature. I recently rerun some calculations comparing 2006 and 2024. Why 2006? Well, it's the first year we have a rating for democracy by the Economist Democracy Index. And compared to 2024, the situation has changed enormously. Currently, about 80% of science is published from countries that are not full democracies. And about 80 to 90% is published in countries, if we look at another index from Reporters Without Borders on freedom of the press, in countries that have no freedom of the press, they have serious problems, difficult situations, problematic situations. In fact, only 4% of science is published from countries with good freedom of the press, the highest ranking element. Now, this doesn't mean that this is bad science, that we should not trust it, that we should have a new type of neo-colonialism. I don't trust the Chinese, I don't trust the Indians, or whatever. But it is a very different landscape. And if you go back to the father of the sociology of science, Robert Merton, practically he said that we cannot have science unless we have democracy. And we know that in most places in the world, we don't really have democracy, and democracy is even receding. What we have is massive growth. We have mega journals, for example. There's about 100 of them that publish more than 2,000 papers every year. Some of them publish more than 20,000 papers every year. Is that science acceptable? I think much of that may be very reasonable, but other pieces may be very, very questionable. We have worse than that. We have evidence of massive fraud. In the past, being fraudulent was a kind of an art. To create a fraudulent paper was an artwork that you had to craft the fake data and the fake paper. Now we have AI that can generate massive amounts of fraudulent information, data sets, publications. We study some of these phenomena through their footprint in the literature. We see people who become extremely highly cited within 3 years. And then you see, where did they get all these citations? You see that they're mostly probably fake papers, not all of them, but many of them, and citation cartels, not just with a couple of people, but with large networks of people who just cite each other. We have predatory journals that we don't even allow ourselves to say which ones are which. Some organizations do, but at legal threat, because obviously you cannot claim that someone is a predatory publisher. Very easily you can get lawsuits for that. We have paper mills, production by companies of papers that sell authorship and may or may not have real data. Most of the time they don't have real data. Many of the retracted papers currently are due to paper mills, but we know that we're just scratching the surface of the phenomenon. And we have also publishers who are using software to detect artificial intelligence created publications. And Wiley did that for hundreds of their journals. They concluded that about 1 out of 7 submissions to their respectable journals are fake AI products. Now, if you think of 7 million papers every year, this means 1 million fake papers fueled and injected into the literature potentially every year. There's some common subjects also within the scientific literature, even the legitimate literature. First of all, there's the quest for significance. When R.A. Fisher proposed statistical significance, he wanted to find a means that we could separate things that are more important, perhaps interesting to pursue further, from others that are less important, less likely to be interesting to pursue further. Currently, when we text mine the entire medical literature, we see that 96% of papers that use p-values have statistically significant results. So it has no discriminating ability, more or less. It is more of a nuisance. And if we model the distribution of results and effects and p-values across different scientific fields, when we have the benefit of having large amounts of evidence and meta-analysis, these are analyses that are based on tens of thousands of meta-analysis in medicine and also large numbers of meta-analysis in other scientific fields, we realize that the most compatible background for that pattern is that most of the significant results are probably not truly significant, probably in the range of 50 to 70%. This is another analysis we've done in economics. About 50 to 70% of the economics literature is not trustworthy. The 30% or 50% that is likely to represent some true effects, the real magnitude of these effects on average is likely to be about a quarter of what is reported in the literature. Many of us want to change this. I think inherently we want to do better research. We want to do better science. So there have been manifestos like this one that I have co-authored with several colleagues from different scientific disciplines several years ago. I'm willing to accept both revolution and evolution, and perhaps small steps, but in the right direction might work. And there are opportunities for these steps to be taken across the whole range of the cycle of scientific activity, from thinking about a research agenda, thinking about hypotheses, testing them out, getting results, trying to publish them, publishing them, perhaps critiquing them, then fueling that into new hypotheses and new ideas. Each one of these steps is ripe with opportunities for errors and biases, but it is also an opportunity to try to improve the reproducibility of the process. Who's going to do that? I think scientists to start with, but scientists alone may not be enough because there's many other stakeholders involved in science. So it could be publishers, it could be institutions, it could be funders, it could be governments in some cases, the general public as well, because they're influenced and affected by science. They do care about science. They see that it shapes their lives. Or if they don't see that, that's really very problematic. Now, what do we want to achieve? Reproducible, trustworthy research. What is that? I think everyone is using that term. I was listening to terminology this morning, said it all sounds nice, but I would like to ask exactly what do we mean by that? So what do we mean by reproducibility? There's very different connotations to that. I would probably break it into three bins. One is reproducibility of methods, which means that I can read the method section of a scientific paper and I can understand what happened. I can go to my lab or I can go to my laptop and do the same thing if I want to do. I can get the raw data. I can get the algorithm. I can click on the link and it opens and it runs. I can put together these chemical substances and okay, they're available and I can do that experiment if I want to. Most of the time, this cannot be done. Reproducibility of results means that, okay, now that I have understood what was done, I'm willing to run another study, more or less the same, or I can modify it. If I understand what was done, I can add some new elements or drop some others, but I know what is the starting point. And now I get a new result, and now I can compare the new result versus the previous result of the previous study. And then we have reproducibility of inferences, which is really the toughest of all. I have 1, 2, 3, 5, 200 million studies, and I ask experts, the best experts, what do you think of that? What do you make of that? How do you read that literature? What kind of conclusions do you reach, let alone what are we going to do now? And here, the inferential reproducibility may be very different. People may or may not reach consensus. They may reach consensus through some very tricky ways, but actually they have not reached consensus. I think that this can be a huge mess. How much of that can we improve? Well, I think reproducibility of methods, we should be able to improve. If we all agree, goodness, I need to understand, John, what you did in your paper. Please show me your methods, show me your data, show me your algorithm, send me the code, put it in GitHub, just do something. It's so easy. You've done it, no? You should have that available. Yes and no, but at least in theory, we should be able to achieve that. Reproducibility of results, there's many fields that go through some soul searching in the last 10, 15 years. Most of them find that 60 to 80% of what they have published in their top journals is not reproducible. Is that a bad sign? Well, it is a starting point that we have to face that and try to improve it. But there's willingness to go back and replicate, especially influential research. Reproducibility of inferences may be the toughest of all. I don't think that this is easy to do. And perhaps the best we can wish is to have transparency. Just tell us what your conflicts are, what your allegiances are, what your background is, what your priors are, so that we can place your opinion, your interpretation in context. And then we have multiple people, multiple organizations who make this type of disclosures, and we can see why they reach some or different conclusions. We've seen some of these problems and the efforts to solve them in action in grand scale in some fields. For example, there's many reproducibility projects like the reproducibility project on cancer biology, where lots of scientists joined forces. They took some creme de la creme, highly cited journal papers, and they said, I want to repeat them. Well, the problem was that 2 out of 3 of these top cited papers could not even get started to be repeated. Even reaching out to the authors and communicating with them and exchanging, how did you do this? There was no way to get the experiment started. The 1/3 that got started, about 60%, we got a different result. Now, the most worrisome part is that for those that did get started, and we did get the result, and we had eLife waiting for the results to get published, committed, I will publish the results of whatever you get. It took on average 197 weeks from starting to finishing. Now you think of a new scientist starting a postdoc or a doctorate and goes to the lab, and the mentor says, oh, well, let's get you started. There's that paper published last year in Nature. Why don't you try to do that experiment again to get your hands wet and start thinking about it? And it takes on average 197 weeks to do an experiment that was already published in Nature. I mean, that's not so good for any young or older scientist. There's also resistance to refutation. Even when we do replications, even when we do better research, more rigorous research, more controlled research, better standardized with more rigorous methods, and we get a different result, the original result will not go away. People will continue to cite it. We have seen that in epidemiology, in clinical medicine, in psychology, in many different fields. They don't cite it because they say it was wrong. They cite it because they ignore the much better work that has been done, and they have built a career based on that, and they have to continue citing and propagating that same fallacy. So our solutions are manifold, and they work sometimes in some fields more than others. This is a list of solutions that I think have worked, and probably there's room for adopting them more widely in more fields and in a more standard way. Large-scale collaboration, teamwork, sharing, cross-checking within a collaboration. Adoption of replication culture, which can be done within teamwork and collaboration. Registration of different elements of the research process, like the protocol, the analysis codes, the data sets, raw data, and also results. Sharing of all of that can go a long way. Reproducibility practices, like the example that I showed for cancer biology, let's go back and recheck what really matters for us. Containment of conflicted sponsors and authors, move them out from very influential policy decision-making, for example. If you need to have them on board, at a minimum, try to have full disclosure of who is who and who is why and who is how. More appropriate statistical methods, standardizing definitions and analysis, more stringent thresholds of claiming discoveries or successes, improvements of study design standards, improvements in peer review, reporting and dissemination research, and better training of all of us, continuous education in methods, in what is new, in what is the new opportunities, but also the new biases that we need to watch out for. Our review system works partly to correct some of the problems that we face. So I fully believe in peer review. I'm the director of the International Congress on Peer Review and Scientific Publication. So I still believe that it has merit. But we know empirically that peer review currently improves about 30% of papers, makes about 5% of scientific papers worse, and about 2/3 of papers are not really touched by peer review. A little bit of aesthetics might change, a few commas and a few full stops and a few words may change, but nothing major happens. And we know that we have other options. For example, we hope to correct the literature after it is published through post-publication peer review. But again, in an empirical survey that we did looking at the top 10 journals in each scientific field, most of these journals have no mechanisms to correct the record. So we have about 1 in 1,000 papers getting retracted, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of those that are flawed. Many journals have even no policy or no process if you want to say, oh goodness, this is completely wrong. Something must be stated about it. Some of them have some options, like you can send a letter to Lancet or Nature, but it has to be 150 words. And then you have to debate if it gets accepted with a copy editor who cuts it back to 118 words, and then you fight to get it to 122. I mean, that's not really a way to correct the literature. And you need to do it very fast also, because if 6 weeks pass, then that's too late for communication of that sort. Can we improve peer review? Well, there's randomized trials on improving peer review. Most of the interventions that have been proposed have very modest benefits. For example, open peer review, blind peer review, training people to do peer review. Who's going to train what and how? I mean, the devil can be in the details. A few things do work. For example, involving methodologists and statisticians in the peer review process does work. We've seen that in randomized trials. The problem is, where are we going to find methodologists and statisticians for 7 million papers every year? There's just very few of them, and they have their own work to do. So if you're interested on more peer review issues, this is the conference that we're running this year in Chicago. Please do join us. There's a lot of debate about how we could optimize that. Now, if we have transparency, we can probe our reproducibility and our trustworthiness. Sometimes we're shaken. For example, this is a very famous randomized trial, 329. It's not a submarine, but it's a randomized trial published in 2001 by Smith, Klein, Beecham. It claimed that paroxetine and imipramine, 2 antidepressants, were very effective and very safe for treating depression in adolescents. 15 years later, independent investigators, not related to pharma, got hold of the data, rerun the analysis. They concluded on the very same data set that both of these antidepressants are not safe and are not effective. How often is that happening? We need to look at the data sets and reanalyze them if we want to see how often it's happening. And along with some of my colleagues, we have started creating a data arc, like Noah's Ark. We have been reaching out to the principal investigators of the top 100 most cited papers in each scientific field. We say, you're an amazing scientist, you've published an amazing piece of work, and we want to maintain the full legacy of that work. Send us the data sets, and we will curate them and make them available for everyone to be able to use them and see them and honor them. So these are results for psychology and psychiatry. We've seen the same in many other fields. What do we see? Most cannot send their data sets. Why? The most common reason is that the principal investigator does not have the data set. The principal investigator has not even seen the data set. I hope they have seen the manuscript that carries their name. The data set has been produced by the industry or the sponsor. They have their own analysts. They sent the analysis and perhaps the manuscript as well to the principal investigator. So we need to change the dynamics of who is doing what and who has control of what. This is another effort that has been going on for a number of years. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has been asking member journals to have data sharing statements. How are you going to make data sets available? So major journals have all adopted this. We looked at the 3 top in medicine, Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, and JAMA, and looking at clinical trials, 500 clinical trials. Yes, most of them had data sharing statements. About half said that there will be individual level participant data available. About 20% said, I will place them in that repository. About 5% had placed them in the repository. And if you wanted the data sets tonight, it would be only 2 out of 500 data sets that you could get. BMJ and PLOS Medicine are more transparent. So BMJ now says, if you publish with me, you need to promise everyone who asks for your data sets, you will give them away. So we did ask the authors of clinical trials publishing these 2 journals to send us their data sets, that they did, and they knew that we will be reanalyzing them. We did reanalyze them, and we always got the same result that has been published. So in a transparent environment where there's responsibility, accountability, and willingness to share, we could get to a point that things would be reproducible. Many fields have understood that to be the norm. For example, is a paper we published in Science 6 years ago, where we argued, as many of us signing that paper, that anything that is publicly funded in genomics should be made available for everyone to use. And I think that this is really the standard in that field for a number of years now. And we do see progress across science in some of these research practices. For example, 20 years ago, less than 1% of scientific papers would share raw data. Now about 20% do that. 0% would share code. Now about 6% do that. 0% would have registered protocols. Now about 8% do that. Almost no one was willing to say, I'm replicating something. Now people are willing to say, I'm trying to replicate something. Fewer people are claiming that they do something novel. I'm not sure whether this is good or not. We have evidence that science is becoming less disruptive. If you look at massive analysis that suggest that we're becoming more minutely incremental in what we do. And a big change, everyone now has placeholders for disclosures. In almost any scientific paper, you will see a placeholder for funding and for conflicts of interest. It doesn't mean that they're accurate. It doesn't mean that they're not complete. Actually, we have evidence that they're clearly not complete, and they're often very misleading, but at least they're asking for that. If you look at who is doing that, it is very heterogeneous across science. These are the same maps of the universe of science, and you see color. This means that this practice is adopted. So you can see that there's some fields that share data sets. A subset of them are sharing also code and algorithms, and a very different set of fields is accustomed to protocols and protocol registration. If you want to have protocols and data sets and code, that's not very common. But probably we can populate with color more many of these universe globes. Science is becoming more complex, and this means we need even more transparent rules for transparency. About 10 years ago, we published some recommendations on how to enhance transparency in computational research. I think most of them would still be valid, but we're facing the dilemma on what to do as science is moving to more and more complex computational tools, like artificial intelligence tools that are creating a new landscape, but it can still be transparent and reproducible. These are some suggestions that we published in Nature a couple of years ago on how to make a deep neural network artificial intelligence study fully transparent. And there are tools and practices and pipelines that this can be done. How about LLMs, large language models? Well, it is a bit more difficult because inherently an LLM is not reproducible. If you ask it this morning a question, it will give you an answer. But if you ask it tomorrow, it has absorbed everything that it got from the web or everywhere that it feeds from. So its knowledge base is different, and its answer may be different tomorrow, depending on what exactly the question is and what the stability of the information might be within 24 hours. Sometimes 5 minutes may matter. In other cases, maybe 20 years will not matter. But LLMs need to be appraised with the same scientific tools and the same scientific methods we have had all along in terms of reproducibility, transparency, and responsible science, because they pose all of these problems of poor performance. In my hands, I don't know, maybe I'm an idiot, but I cannot get them to work as well as others say that they do. Misinformation, inequalities, and other societal impact that they create, the impact on scientific ecosystem, I can promise you that I'm Johnny Anides, but maybe next year, instead of me, there will be some AI agent talking to you, looking very much like Johnny Anides. Impossible to tell. So are they going to replace us? Ethics and broader issues. Here's one example of how AI is potentially changing the landscape. I believe that Stanford has the highest computational capacity than any university, but this means we are at about 1% of all these companies like Meta, Alphabet, Microsoft, Apple. Most of them are like in our neighborhood in Silicon Valley. Of course, the Nobel Prize went to Google DeepMind on a question that universities and research institutes and scientists had been struggling for decades to do some work and progress on protein structure, and then brute force computational capacity, giving you the ability to have AlphaFold and protein structure very nicely predicted for the majority of proteins. But it's unlikely that it's only going to be roses and nice discoveries. Most of that research probably is not going to be shared. Most of that research may be proprietary, kept within these companies for whatever competitive reasons they may have. Sometimes they may open some of the software that they have, which means that they will be able to absorb also the ideas and whatever is left from the non-corporate community. And at one point, you wake up one morning and, oh, we're closing that again. Thank you very much. We got everything that we wanted from you. And we go on with our own rules from now on. Now, as I said, research practices can be improved, and I think that they do develop and eventually give us some more credible research, but not always. Here's one nice example. This is a very prominent paper published in Nature Human Behavior a couple of years ago. The title is High Replicability of Newly Discovered Social Behavioral Findings is Achievable. Creme de la creme authors, among the most trustworthy across all science, extremely highly cited paper, a lot of attention. Practically it showed if you follow rigorous registration practices, you can go close to 100% reproducibility. A minor problem, the paper was retracted a few months later because it had not followed rigorous reproducibility practices, and what it had promised to have done was not what actually had been done. It was a completely exploratory analysis with a completely different aim, and that was a secondary analysis that probably had no validity. So I think we need to be very careful on what solutions we propose and how strongly we propose them. There will be uncertainty all the time. There will be decisions that need to be made. We need to balance benefits and harms for each one of the interventions on research practices. To conclude, the scientific literature is rapidly growing. It is changing in terms of its essential features. Despite improvements in some fields, the massive production of flawed papers has increased overall. Most of these 7 million papers are not very trustworthy. The discussion surrounding how to improve research practice has been intense. There may be a ceiling on how much we can achieve, and this is not necessarily bad news. Perhaps some high-risk field has a ceiling of 5% reproducibility. That may be fine if currently it's 0.5% and we can get it to 5%. So perfection is unattainable, but improvements are possible. And everything that I discuss, all of these reproducibility markers and practices, they're surrogates. Science is more complex than that. It is more than that. It is a very complex phenomenon. It's a human phenomenon embedded within society, within our norms of what we expect, what we want humans to be and do and continue to exist, hopefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ioannidis. There is time for just a few questions before we move into the coffee break. The first hand I saw was Ulrich's.
Many people in ENSSER, though, have experienced good science. Often they put themselves in a peer review position to look at critical papers. The papers were not liked by the establishment, and they were one or two famous examples retracted. The authors despised. The thing has gone wrong, not because it was bad science, as far as we know, but because it wasn't liked. It's a different issue from the one you talked about. I'm sure you have something to say to connect.
Criticism and even more so retraction is a very, very debated phenomenon. And I think it's very heterogeneous. You can have situations where scientists themselves may say, I want to retract my paper. Goodness, I made an error. And that's actually amazing. And I have full respect for that when it's happening. You may have other situations where the research is completely flawed, or even fake, or even fraudulent. You may have other situations where actually it is just in the eye of the cyclone, that somehow the prevailing environment and some very strong perceptions and conflicts and interests don't like that paper. So then it may get bombarded, and sometimes it may get retracted. And if you're an outsider, you might look and say, goodness, I've seen millions of papers that are worse than that, and this is among the best. Why that in particular? Perhaps there's some other reason. Retraction notes are very sparse in wording. Most of the time it's like a sentence, not saying much. It may say that the authors want to retract, or that the editors don't have trust or something like that. But there's very little information. And the reason for that usually is legal, that there's a very huge legal battle going on in the background. And people don't want to stick out their neck and put more that could be debated in court. So I have wondered a lot about our self-correction mechanisms. Some of my colleagues believe that, goodness, we're retracting only 1 out of 1,000 papers. We should be retracting, I don't know, 50%, 70%, 90%. I don't believe that. I want to see correction. I want to see the literature becoming more valid. I'm not so much interested to fight all these emotional, legal, kind of friction-laden battles that occur much of the time. But of course, now we have all these completely fake papers. I mean, fake papers at least we should be able to get rid of. But even that is not easy.
Thank you. I see many hands now, and there's also one online, but for reasons of time, I would like to stop here because we're running very, very late, and also because Professor Ioannidis is taking place in the panel that we'll hear after the coffee break. So with apologies, I want to start the coffee break now. It's just past 11, we're close to half an hour late. The coffee break was to be 25 minutes. Is it okay if I cut it down to 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. So we'll start at 11:10. Thank you very much.